Yes, so hello, I'm Elizabeth Lance. I'm going to be summarizing some of the rulings that you just went through and looking at them in aggregate so we can pull out some high-level lessons learned. Because there's a lot that you just went through with David and Justin. Thank you in terms of the technical details. But for people who are doing some of the hands-on work, what does this mean in practical terms? And just a shorter version of some of the things that we've just gone over. The biggest being the process length, because I don't know if anyone noticed some of those dates, some of the key themes, and why standard practice, even though it's officially not in the 5 questions that were in the policies up until recently, it is still relevant. So the ones that I was looking at were Canafric and the other grouping here, 5 in terms of what the impact was for these particular ones. One of the big things that I did want to draw everyone's attention to was the actual length of these processes. So you'll notice that a lot of these were resolved in 2022 and 2023, but the actual dates under review go back quite far, some as far as 11 years in the past. So if you're working with any groups who are eager to perhaps go through this process for whatever reason, letting them know exactly what they're up against in terms of time and effort will be really important. One of the things that we were looking at, as well as taking a look at whether or not the costs impacted how long it took. And at least for this set of cases, it didn't have a huge impact. Some of the smaller ones in terms of the amounts under dispute actually took the longest, whereas the ones with larger amounts took less time, but it was still a considerable amount of time that these files were being disputed through the system. There are a couple of key themes, as you likely noted. The biggest one is technological uncertainty and making sure that that's clearly defined. But after that, expert witnesses definitely came up as a recurring theme across multiple cases. The importance of contemporaneous documentation, despite some assertions that we don't need it, as you saw, in many cases you do. Where the burden of proof is and the knowledge base, which also ties into technological uncertainties. So just going through some of them quickly again in terms of a recap, in terms of the win, the food manufacturing case in terms of extending the technology was a win, which was great. The key lessons really did revolve around the technological uncertainty side of things and the 5 questions, which we've alluded to, but I'm going to tease out a little bit more here as we go through it. And it just reconfirms the importance of some of these earlier rulings, despite what's happening right now in terms of the shift from the eligibility of work policy to the more recent guidelines, which talk about the why and the how of SR&ED. These remain the gold standard in terms of what you are assessed against ultimately. So at the end of the day, as nice as these simplified guidelines are for the taxpayers in terms of an accessible document, underneath all of that, the same measurement tools are being used over and over again. So fundamentally, it hasn't changed. And if you're talking to anyone who says that it has, it's important to draw them back to this. This is the key thing. You have to meet those criteria. The 5 questions, we saw some of them up on the screen in the last presentation. The last iteration of them before they were removed from the policy documents that are publicly on record that are being used, actually didn't have the term standard practice in it. So they had refined it down over the years such that these were the simplified version of the 5 questions, last updated around 2015. So was there scientific or technological uncertainty, the hypothesis, the language that David was calling out in terms of not saying the scientific method, but a systematic investigation or search because they believed that was more accessible, the purpose that it was undertaken for, and some of the other key terms here. So it's really important to remember the 5 questions and where they're coming from. So again, the last version, and I have the evolution of this on the SR&ED Education Resources website, which I'll link afterwards. Keep this in mind as you go through and you answer your questions. So again, drawing back to what David said, expert witnesses are absolutely key in this, and making sure that you have a good expert witness as you go through this process. If you go this far, again, cost benefit analysis, not just in terms of the financial implications, if you're going through this on success-based fees, but also the time for the organization and the overall financial impact for them. The key sentence that does keep coming up, and I know the CRA has tried to get away from it, but it's a recurring theme, so it's important to talk about it, is standard practice. And the concept of standard practice does go all the way back to Northwest Hydraulics. And in that, they do align standard practice with routine engineering, so describing techniques, procedures, and data that are generally accessible to competent professionals in the field. So those two terms, routine engineering, standard practice, tend to be synonymous. They're still creeping into a lot of documents, and as you saw, it did impact the results of a lot of these cases. It was actually a huge issue a few years ago, and it's coming back again with a new flock of reviewers that seem to have recently been hired. A lot of the SR&ED applications were turned down because the reviewers indicated that it was standard practice. David outlined some of the strategies and techniques you can use to avoid being boxed in this way, if you will, and making sure that your work doesn't come across as standard practice. So while it was officially removed from policies in 2015, it's still in place, and about half of the projects here were selected for review based on that criteria, and it's still an implied measurement today. If anyone sat through a recent review, this is still an issue. And this, again, came up in a lot of them, and it seemed to be a recurring theme. Over and over again, they talked about the view that this could have been solved using routine technical studies or usual procedures known to competent specialists in the field. So that was with Anne-Marie Chagnon. So going back to the technological uncertainties, and then the burden of proof. So I do find it really interesting that in the one major win we talked about earlier, the judge called out the CRA for not accepting written documentation and not accepting verbal testimony. But in some of these other cases, it really gets emphasized over and over again the importance of having the documentation on hand at the outset of these review processes. So it's best to have it on hand as opposed to relying on whether or not the RTA you happen to have will accept your discussion and explanations of the work under review. And this, again, recurring theme in a lot of them. So Dave's Diesel as well. So we do have those 5 questions coming up. The importance of the expert witnesses, as David rightly pointed out, and then contemporaneous documentation again. So the importance of having documentation on hand that explains the work that you're doing. And it's very much, you can skip this and see if you get the reviewer who will accept your explanations, or more realistically, you should have this on hand because that is what they are asking for in that 5th question. Again, in Gestion ACBK, similar challenges that we're looking at. So the themes across most of these losses are fairly consistent. The technological uncertainties, the contemporaneous documentation, and establishing that knowledge base at the outset of your projects. Any consultant will advise that you should absolutely sit down and do that literature review at the outset. Most groups don't. If for no other reason, that in some spaces, the state of the art moves so quickly right now. If we take a look at some of the AI and large language models that are coming out, What was difficult last week is not difficult this week. It's important to capture all of that information so that when you look back on a specific point in time, say 11 years later, when you're arguing over $37,000, you know what the state of the art was at that point in time. Other ones, similar, watching out for all of those uncertainties and knowledge-based issues again as you go through this process. And keeping an eye on exactly what you want to commit to in terms of costs. Because some of these are actually really rather small if you take a look at the costs that are amounts that are under dispute. And you have to wonder about the investment that's being made in terms of the CEO's time, the CTO's time, over $17,000 or $70,000. You add it together, it does add up. But is it worth 10 years? Justin, I saw you unmute yourself momentarily. Do you have any color commentary that you would like to add? I don't think Justin. Do you have any?
I just switched devices because I was running out of battery. I apologize.
But I'm sure Justin would agree in that sense. You do have to pick your battles when it comes to this.
Yes.
Because it can go quite far, and we'll likely talk about that later on during the panel. So again, taking a look at the technological uncertainties, I'm not going to read everything that's on the screen because it's been covered in detail by Dave already. And the goal of this is to sum it up. But watching out for those technological uncertainties as they come through in the 5 questions and having your expert witnesses is absolutely key. So in terms of the summary and the key takeaways, if we look at these in aggregate as opposed to the detailed individual cases, there really are some key themes that we can keep in mind that will improve our overall practices as we go through these applications. The most major and significant of which is the systematic investigation or search. So structuring all of the work that you're doing in this format to avoid those misperceptions of trial and error, and actively pushing back against the reviewers who try to position systematic investigation or searches as trial and error. As we saw in some of the winning cases, the courts may not agree with the CRA if they take a hardline approach. And it's important to establish that early on, working with your RTA that the work was done in good faith to generate the missing information that you needed in order to proceed. Establishing that uncertainty, so the gap in the knowledge base, and why experimental development is the only option for proceeding, that you absolutely have to conduct these experiments and you have to generate new information and new knowledge in order to achieve your objectives. I see something's come up on the chat, but I don't think I can see what it is. That's fine. Do you compare your work to the 5 questions and ensure that you have documentation to support it? So again, you can wait to see if a judge 10 years later will support the verbal testimony. A stitch in time saves 9 in terms of having this information available in written format. And one of the things that consultants often discuss amongst themselves is how to manage some of the more challenging reviews and reviewers. And we found over the years that if you have good written documentation that they can rely on and to write their technical reports, it tends to result in more favorable outcomes. Verbal testimony, verbal feedback, conversations are often prone to being misunderstood or simply forgotten as soon as you log off the call with the RTA and they move on to the next file. Making sure that you have an expert, be it in-house or otherwise, can be crucial as well. And then one of the things that did come up was the burden of proof in terms of the balance of probability is not beyond a reasonable doubt. That's for lawyers to argue about until the end of time. But having sufficient evidence to show that the work was performed in the manner described, in the period, so that the costs can be justified. We really do want to have them get to yes sooner rather than later in the process so that you can get that refund when you need it. So again, quick recap in terms of all of the things that you've heard so far over the last hour and a bit in terms of keeping an eye on those 5 questions. If you are a consultant or an individual who's currently applying on your own, make sure that you do have those 5 questions handy and you know how they fit into the forms that you're submitting. So you still answer all of those questions. They do appear in different formats in the T4088 as it applies to the T661. When you're filling it out, don't just answer the questions on the T661. Establish your knowledge base outside of the technical reports that you submit to the CRA. Do keep copies of the supporting documentation, those boxes that you check as you go through, and then be prepared to wait. This was alluded to by Earl in terms of even just getting the refunds processed. With the strike that's happened, there have been delays. Even the reviews themselves, it seems like some of the reviewers are quite overwhelmed right now. And the processing times, while they technically meet it for the majority of the claims, you may not be one of that 90% that is being processed on time. And there may be delays there as well. So keep in mind, even at the early stages, there can be delays from when you file to when you're selected for review, to when you receive the letter, to if you file a notice of objection. And then if you go all the way through, that is playing quite a long game for sometimes minimal amounts. So something to keep in mind as you go through. So that's a summary of the deck for today and the Tax Court of Canada rulings in aggregate in terms of some of the key lessons learned. But I think the key takeaway is keep an eye on standard practice and routine engineering. While those terms don't apply in the policies, they're clearly still being circulated. And the 5 questions do remain the benchmark to which most of the claims are going to be held, if not at the initial stages, then absolutely later on in the process.